Today, we're turning our attention to Martin Heidegger's really significant work, Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics. We're aiming to understand his quite unique take on Immanuel Kant's attempt to establish the very groundwork for metaphysics. Now, it's really important to get this right. This isn't like building some kind of pre-existing structure in philosophy.
Right. It's more about uncovering something fundamental.
As Kant himself put it in the Critique of Pure Reason, metaphysics seems to stem from a basic human tendency. Heidegger's analysis tries to, uncover this deep inclination.
And to really get Heidegger's angle, you have to think about the Kant scholarship back in the early 20th century. People like H. Heimswith, M. Wundt. They mostly saw the critique as, well, theory of knowledge or epistemology, focused on how we know things.
The mechanics of cognition, basically.
Right. But Heidegger shifts the focus. He pushes towards something more foundational.
He brings forward what he thinks is the real core problem driving what gets called first philosophy. And this is a problem you can trace way back to the beginnings of philosophy. It's about understanding the inner possibility of ontology, the knowledge of beings just as beings, and how that connects intricately with knowing the most significant realm of beings, which shapes our understanding of being overall. This inherent possibility, the very origin of ontological knowledge that Heidegger sees at the heart of Kant's project of laying a groundwork for metaphysics. Why Kant? What got Heidegger so interested, so fired up that he wrote a whole book on him? What was the big question driving him?
Well, the main reason, according to Heidegger himself, was actually to clear up some, let's say, misunderstandings about his own big work, Being and Time.
Ah, okay. So it was partly defensive or clarification.
Clarification, I think.
Yeah.
He felt his core idea, the question of being, what does it even mean to be, was being missed or misinterpreted.
So how did Kant fit in? Did he see Kant as like an ally in this project?
In a way, yes. He zeroed in on a specific part of Kant's critique, and Heidegger saw something crucial there, a potential link, maybe a bridge, between those huge traditional questions of metaphysics, the being question again, and something more concrete. Time.
Wow, okay. So using Kant's ideas about how concepts relate to intuition over time to bolster his own focus on being and time.
That's the core idea. He wasn't just reading Kant. He was using Kant's work, almost like finding an advocate within Kant for his own philosophical direction, reinterpreting it to shed new light on his project.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, let's dig into this concept Kant had, laying the ground for metaphysics. What exactly was Kant up to there, and how did Heidegger see it?
Heidegger frames Kant's project as this fundamental effort to establish a Grundlegung, literally ground laying, like putting down the foundation for a building.
Right, the groundwork for all of metaphysics.
Exactly. But, and this is key, Kant also saw metaphysics not just as something philosophers build, but as a sort of natural construction, something already present in all humans, a natural tendency.
Okay, so laying a foundation for something that's kind of already there, that sounds tricky.
It is a bit paradoxical, isn't it? And that's where Heidegger highlights Kant's key questions. First, what did Kant mean by metaphysics? Second, where do you even start laying this ground? And third, maybe most importantly, why is this whole process a critique of pure reason? Why the critique?
And this is where Heidegger starts to really push back against the standard view of Kant, right? That the critique is just about how we know things.
The common take is often, it's epistemology, theory of knowledge.
Yeah.
How does the mind work? How do we understand the world? Heidegger says, no, it goes much deeper. It's fundamentally about ontology.
The study of being, which fits perfectly with Heidegger's own focus, of course.
Right. So for Heidegger, Kant's ground laying isn't just about knowledge. It's about understanding what it means to be. It's an ontological project at its core.
And how did this connect back to the history of philosophy, to, say, Aristotle or Plato?
Heidegger argues that Kant, by doing this, enters into maybe an implicit dialogue with those earlier giants. The whole question of ontology, of what being is, becomes problematic for Kant in a new way. It's not just taken for granted anymore.
So moving away from maybe vague ideas about being?
Yes, demanding clarity on how we universalize concepts, how we step beyond the immediate crass being itself. Whether Kant succeeded fully is another question for Heidegger. The point is, he saw the need for this deeper inquiry.
And this wasn't just an academic exercise, right? Not just to help out the sciences.
No, absolutely not. Heidegger stresses that for Kant, ontology isn't just some preliminary step for physics or whatever. It comes from a higher interest, something fundamental to human reason itself, a deep need to understand existence.
Okay, that sets the stage nicely. Let's move to this idea of the finitude of knowledge. That sounds really central to Heidegger's reading. What does finite knowledge mean here?
It's absolutely crucial for Heidegger's interpretation. He defines finite knowledge very specifically as non-creative intuition. Basically, what we know through our senses, through intuition, has to be something already at hand, something that exists independently before we know it.
So our minds don't just create reality out of nothing. We're limited receivers.
That's a good way to put it. Our intuition is dependent. It's derived intuitus derivatis, Heidegger calls it, using Kant's Latin. It has to let the object present itself. We can't just will an object into existence by thinking about it.
Okay, that makes sense. We receive, we don't create the thing itself. But the outline mentioned original intuition. What's the contrast?
Right. He contrasts our finite intuition with a hypothetical original intuition, an intuitus originarius. This would be a kind of knowing that could actually let something spring forth just by intuiting it. Absolute knowledge, perhaps like a divine creator's.
Something totally beyond human capacity. So our knowledge is always limited, always dependent on what's given.
That's the key takeaway for Heidegger's Kant. So let's dive into Heidegger's interpretation of how Kant tried to do this.
Okay. Heidegger argues that the first really essential step in setting up this groundwork is clarifying the essence of knowledge itself in general terms. And he makes a pretty crucial distinction here. Knowledge as just representing something, he calls it vorstellen, versus a more fundamental kind of knowledge, wissen, which is more like the guiding framework.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. Vorstellen sounds like, well, just mirroring what's out there, passively.
Sort of, yes. Whereas wissen implies something deeper, maybe a grasp of the principles that make knowing possible in the first place. So following that, Heidegger brings in this idea of finite knowledge. He calls it non-creative intuition. What that means is basically that whatever we grasp directly in its specific detail has to already be there. It has to be at hand, independent of us looking at it. So our finite intuition, this intuitus derivativus, is deduced, meaning it depends on these things that already exist. It can't just make the object exist by intuiting it. It has to let the object show itself.
So our senses are fundamentally receivers,
Right.
They register what's already present. But where does thinking, our understanding, fit in? Well, because finite intuition is receptive, it has to be solicited or affected, as Heidegger puts it, by whatever's intuitable. That's where thinking comes in. Thinking uses concepts, makes judgments to sort of determine the particular thing that intuition gives us. Heidegger calls this the veritative synthesis. It's about making the thing we encounter evident as an object. That's different from the predicative synthesis, which is more about how concepts fit together in a judgment itself.
Okay, so we sense something, and then our mind uses concepts to make sense of it, to categorize it. But this whole process in Heidegger's reading has built-in limits.
Heidegger stresses that representing something, bringing it to mind, always involves this circuitousness, an Umweg, he calls it, a detour through a universal concept. This dependency on the universal, this need to classify the specific thing, is a key sign of our finitude, the finitude of our understanding.
We don't have that original intuition.
Right, the kind that could just bring the being forth itself. Our understanding works by applying these general concepts we already have to whatever our finite intuition picks up.
And this is where things get really interesting, because this finitude seems to force a rereading of those big Kantian ideas, appearance and thing in itself.
Absolutely. Heidegger doesn't see these as two separate kinds of things, like different worlds out there that our knowledge might access differently. He sees them through the lens of finite versus infinite knowledge. So the idea of something behind the appearance isn't some hidden entity. It's about the necessary concealment that comes because our knowledge is finite. The thing in itself remains totally beyond our grasp in its fullness, precisely because we're finite.
So when Kant says we only ever deal with appearances in the sensible world, he's not saying reality is less real, it's more a statement about us.
Precisely that. Mere appearance isn't a knock on reality's status, it's denying that we can have infinite knowledge of it. And that phrase outside us gets two meanings too. The thing in itself is outside us because we lack the infinite intuition to grasp it. Appearances are outside us simply because they are distinct from us, the knower, even though we can access them through our senses and intellect.
Right.
So at the end of the day, for Heidegger, appearance and thing in itself are concepts grounded in the finitude of the human being, not just two types of objects for some neutral knowledge faculty.
Okay, that clarifies the view on knowledge and its limits. So let's move on to how Heidegger sees Kant actually laying the groundwork for metaphysics, this pure knowledge you mentioned earlier.
Right. The task, as Heidegger reads it, is to understand where ontological knowledge comes from, not as a finished system, but like a fundamental seed. He really stresses how interconnected finite intuition, sensibility, and understanding are. He quotes Kant himself, "Neither of these qualities is to be preferred to the other."
That quote really highlights they depend on each other, doesn't it? Can't have one without the other.
And Heidegger points us to Kant's idea of the sources of knowledge coming from a common root, which, Kant admits, remains unknown to us. This is a really key point. The Kantian groundwork, in Heidegger's view, doesn't lead to absolute certainty or obvious first principles.
It goes somewhere else.
It delves into and points directly towards the unknown. It's like a philosophical grounding for philosophy itself, you could say.
So how this origin gets revealed is just as important as the origin itself. Heidegger talks about stages of ground laying. What are they?
Well, Heidegger explains that grounding metaphysics is basically about projecting the inner possibility of a priori synthesis. That's knowledge we have before experience, but which shapes our experience. The first stage is identifying the core parts of pure knowledge, pure intuition and pure thinking. But even when looking at them separately, Heidegger insists we have to keep the main problem in mind, the problem of pure finite knowledge.
And you mentioned earlier he stresses thinking's dependence on intuition here.
This dependence isn't just a minor detail, it's fundamental. If you just look at a pure concept on its own as a notion, you lose its vital connection to intuition. It becomes just a fragment of pure knowledge, really.
Then we get to pure intuition itself, which Kant says is space and time. Heidegger really highlights time here, doesn't he?
He does. Kant says, time is the formal a priori condition of all appearances whatsoever. Because it's so universal, Heidegger argues time becomes the sort of guiding essential element of pure knowledge, of the transcendence that makes knowledge possible. He doesn't totally ignore space, but he suggests that grounding time's universality as pure intuition and seeing its central ontological role is the main thing. He even wonders if space got a bit sidelined in Kant's focus.
And then there are the pure concepts of the understanding the categories. How do they fit into this first stage?
These pure concepts or notions are how we determine the particulars given in intuition, by relating them to something that applies for many. Heidegger digs into Kant's idea of reflection as the basic act of forming a concept. It's a process of considering, gathering different representations in one consciousness, comparing, abstracting. He notes that these pure concepts within the understanding are seen as the very basis for being able to make judgments at all. They're revealed by analyzing the faculty of understanding itself.
But you also mentioned there's this ongoing debate about where the categories come from, specifically the table of judgments.
Yes, that's a critical point.
Yeah.
Whether you can adequately ground the categories just based on the table of judgments is still debated by scholars. Kant laid out the table based on quantity, quality, relation, modality. But whether these categories really stem from the deep essence of understanding is, well, questionable for some. Heidegger notes Kant himself tweaked his descriptions of the table, and he mentions Kant's critique of Aristotle's categories too.
So the implication is,
If the origin of categories is shaky at this stage, then maybe the table of judgments has a different role to play in making ontological knowledge possible in the first place.
okay, so stage one identifies the pure elements, but also flags up some tricky issues and open questions. What happens in the next stages of this ground laying?
Stage 2, for Heidegger, shifts towards the essential unity of pure knowledge. This unity needs to bring together all the different structural syntheses. While the veritative synthesis making beings evident is sort of primary when asking about this unity, Heidegger stresses the focus here is on the pure veritative synthesis. That's the original coming together of pure universal intuition, time, and pure thinking. Kant himself says something crucial here. The same function which gives unity to the various representations in a single judgment also gives unity to the mere synthesis of various representations in a single intuition, which, expressed generally, is called the pure concept of the understanding.
The same function.
Right. For Heidegger, this sameness isn't just a formal link. It's about a deep, original wholeness.
And this loops back to the categories problem, right? If they're really about the structure of being itself, not just how we talk about things, then the being we know must somehow be in them directly. They need to be purely intuitable somehow.
Exactly. And that leads to the third stage, the inner possibility of the essential unity of ontological synthesis. This is where pure intuition and pure thinking have to be able to meet a priori in a pure synthesis. Heidegger reads Kant's transcendental deduction of the categories as the attempt to show this original self-formation, this essential unity of ontological knowledge coming together. He does warn, though, that he's not going to track every single step of the deduction. He wants to get at the original motivation behind the whole problem.
And what is that core motivation? What's the basic aim of the transcendental deduction?
Heidegger claims the fundamental goal is to shed light on the transcendence of finite reason. Think about it. A finite knower, one who doesn't create reality, can only relate to a being if that being can be encountered as already there. But to encounter it as the specific being it is, it first has to be recognized generally as a being. This implies some kind of pre-ontological knowledge or understanding. This pre-understanding is the condition that allows something to stand against us, to be an object for us as finite beings. We need this opposition.
He also talks about investigating the objective representations as what stands opposed. That sounds key to objectivity itself?
It is. The object, Gegenstand, is what stands against us in this pure act of letting it stand against, in rein Gegenstand lassen. And this standing against has a kind of necessity to it. Heidegger highlights the understanding as the supreme faculty in our finitude. But paradoxically, this supremacy actually requires it to depend on pure intuition, even in this most basic act of letting stand against. And this can't be empirical intuition, it has to be pure intuition.
Then Heidegger lays out these two ways for the deduction, from above and from below. What's the point of these different paths?
Well, the first way, from above, starts with how pure understanding depends on pure intuition. The idea is to clarify pure understanding itself, to show why it intrinsically needs pure synthesis, and therefore pure intuition. The second way, from below, starts with empirical intuition and works upwards, trying to show the necessary link between understanding through the categories and appearances. But Heidegger notes something interesting. Kant almost immediately jumps from talking about sense to talking about the pure power of imagination.
Why?
Because sense itself, Kant seems to imply, doesn't inherently contain connections. It's the imagination's job to sort of present connection, relation in general.
So imaginations are the crucial go-between here.
Absolutely. Heidegger explains that any connection, especially the pure forming of unity, structurally relies on a prior representation of unity. For this unity-making to work a priori, the representation of unity itself must also be a priori, always the same, accompanying all acts of unification. This fixed and lasting self, Heidegger says, is the eye of transcendental apperception. Just like time underlies all empirical intuition, this preforming affinity within the transcendental imagination is fundamental.
Which brings us nicely to the transcendental schematism. Heidegger calls it the pure making sensible. That's essential to transcendence. What exactly does it do?
The schematism tries to provide an image for a concept, to make the abstract idea somehow perceivable in intuition. But, and this is crucial, Heidegger stressed it, echoing Kant, the schemata of pure concepts aren't like regular pictures you can form in your mind from experience that relate to a kind of pure discernibility. And the pure image for the schemata of the pure concepts of understanding is fundamentally time, the temporal. Schemata essentially determine time. They are a priori determinations, transcendental determinations of time. Kant calls them a transcendental product of the power of imagination.
Can you give an example? You mentioned the schema for substance.
Right. Take the concept of substance. Through the schematism, this concept gets a pure image in time, namely, the image of persistence, of remaining the same through time. This pure image of persistence makes objectivity discernible, makes it something we can grasp a priori, assuming substance is part of what makes something the object. The schematized concept is there in advance, you see, allowing something that is unalterable through change to show itself to our experience within this pre-existing framework of pure persistence. As Kant put it, to time, itself immutable and abiding, there corresponds an appearance, what is abiding in existence.
Okay, so the schematism is like the bridge, connecting pure concepts and sense experience, and time is the material the bridge is built from, the universal image.
Heidegger argues the schematism is the very ground for the inner possibility of ontological knowledge. It shapes what stands against us in that pure letting stand against. It ensures that what we think purely, the categories, is necessarily given in an intuitable way through the pure image of time. Time, being given a priori, gives this horizon of transcendence, the character of being perceivable, offering itself up, and gives it a kind of preliminary boundary or enclosedness.
He also mentioned Kant's presentation of schematism is pretty complex.
Oh, yes. Kant moves from the general idea of subsumption to analyzing empirical and mathematical schemata, then the transcendental schema generally, then specific schemata for each category, and finally arguing that transcendental schematism is the only condition for transcendence. It's definitely intricate.
Right. Now, going beyond the schematism, Heidegger talks about the highest synthetic principle. How does this relate to laying the ground for metaphysics?
Heidegger sees this highest principle as the full, final determination of what transcendence is. It's a critical move against traditional metaphysics, which often thought you could get knowledge just by analyzing concepts. He stresses that just thinking, analytic judgment, only clarifies what you already represent. It doesn't give you new, real knowledge.
So just fiddling with concepts in our heads isn't enough for genuine knowledge of the world.
Precisely. You absolutely need intuition. You need the concept of an object in general as the condition that makes objective experience, and therefore true knowledge, knowledge that actually matches the object possible at all. This non-empirical object equals X is what our initial turning towards aims at. It's distinguishable in pure intuition, and it forms the horizon against which we can then encounter actual specific beings.
And the power of imagination comes back in here again, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Heidegger really emphasizes imagination as this vital intermediary faculty, sitting between sensibility and understanding. He sees it as forming the very look, the appearance of the horizon of objectivity within the pure image of time. And it does this before any specific experience happens. Imagination's preforming of these pure schemata-like substance being persistence over time brings the very possibility of constant presence into view. It's only within that constant presence that any specific presence of an object can then show up.
He even calls it creative. Is it making reality?
Well, not unaffordably created. It doesn't conjure beings out of nothing. But it is creative because it freely forms these images within the pure image of time without needing specific empirical input for that act of forming. Heidegger does point out a tension in Kant's own writing about the status of this transcendental power of imagination. Sometimes Kant presents it like a third basic faculty, alongside sensibility and understanding.
And other times?
Other times, it seems to get folded back into the understanding. Heidegger also highlights the difference between the first and second editions of the Critique here, noting how the explicit role of imagination seems, well, diminished in the second edition.
This all seems to set the stage for thinking more deeply about time and the self, and how they fit into this ground of possibility.
Right. Heidegger interprets Kant's comment that space and time must always affect the concept of representations of objects. He takes this to mean that time, understood as pure self-affection, is part of the inner possibility of letting something stand against, and also part of pure apperception, the I. He reads the fixed and perduring I not necessarily as some kind of mental substance, but as the necessary correlate for all representations, is what carries out the letting stand against and forms the being in opposition to. This fixing and perduring is essential to the act of letting stand against itself.
So the I isn't separate from time, but deeply intertwined with it.
Yes, that's the idea. Heidegger argues the essence of time is this pure providing of the pure look of the present. The fixed and perduring I, as original time, is what forms the letting stand against in its horizon.
Yeah.
He also looks at Kant's use of at the same time, zugleich. He argues it's not just about being in time, but expresses a fundamental temporal character that belongs to all identification, underpinning even the laws of logic like non-contradiction.
Okay.
And because the self is originally time, in this view, it can't be grasped as simply being temporal or within time. Pure sensibility, time, and pure reason, the I, belong together in the unity of the same essence. That unity makes finite human subjectivity possible.
And the transcendental imagination connects them, acts as the bridge.
That's exactly Heidegger's point. He sees original time as what enables the transcendental power of imagination to be this unique thing, essentially spontaneous receptivity and receptive spontaneity. It unites pure sensibility and pure apperception in what he calls a finite, pure, sensible reason. And he argues that downplaying or removing the transcendental imagination, as perhaps happened in the second edition of the Critique, makes it much harder to grasp this essential unity of sensibility and thinking in human reason.
Wow. This whole exploration seems to really bring us to the absolute core of the problem, human finitude and what that means for metaphysics.
Absolutely. Heidegger argues that Kant's questioning was so radical, it brought the very possibility of metaphysics to, well, an abyss. He suggests that the increased focus on pure reason in the second edition might have inadvertently pushed aside the power of imagination, hiding its crucial transcendental role. For Heidegger, the specific finitude of human nature is the decisive factor for laying the ground for metaphysics. The whole project of ground laying, in his reading, is fundamentally rooted in asking about finitude in human beings. It makes finitude a philosophical problem in a new way.
So it's not just about mapping the structures of knowledge, but understanding those structures as inescapably shaped by our being finite creatures.
Heidegger reads Kant's project as an analytic of finite knowledge, breaking it down into its elements. It's a study of our inner nature, but one guided specifically by this problem of finitude. And he's careful to distinguish this from what gets called philosophical anthropology. He argues that just studying humans anthropologically doesn't automatically ground in metaphysics. In fact, it might even distract from the need to frame the question of human beings specifically with metaphysics in mind.
Right, which then leads into Heidegger's own big project, the metaphysics of Dasein. How does he see that as a maybe more original way of tackling this task of ground laying?
Well, Heidegger calls for a more fundamental retrieval, one that really lights up the essential link between ground laying and the question of finitude. He points out that Kant started with metaphysica generalis, or ontology, the question of being as such, in relation to beings as a whole. This has been a core issue for first philosophy since Aristotle. But Heidegger insists that the question of being as such has to come before the question about beings as a whole.
So before we can understand everything that is, we first need to grapple with what it means to be at all.
Exactly that. Heidegger believed this question of being is part of the very essence of philosophy, and philosophy itself is a crucial possibility for human Dasein. Asking about how we can even understand being stems from our existing preconceptual grasp of being. It forces us back to the fundamental question: what is the nature of this understanding of being in general? So for Heidegger, the task of laying the ground for metaphysics, if you understand it more originally, becomes about explaining the inner possibility of understanding being itself.
And this is where finitude comes back in a very direct way.
Yes, absolutely. Working out the question of being, Heidegger argues, shows its deep internal connection to human finitude. He goes so far as to say that the understanding of being, seins verstandnis, is the innermost essence of finitude. And that understanding provides the real basis for tackling the problem of grounding metaphysics and gives shape to the question about what it means to be human.
He uses the term Dasein here. Can you briefly explain what he means by that in this context?
Dasein, for Heidegger, is the term for the being, that we are the human being. It's the being that exists among other beings but relates to them as beings. It's fundamentally different from other beings precisely because its existence is defined by this relationship, by having an understanding of being, however implicit. Heidegger says an analysis of Dasein has to show how human being, particularly in its everydayness, tends to cover up or forget this understanding of being, this original finitude.
So this metaphysics of Dasein isn't just another philosophical system. It's digging into the very conditions that make metaphysics possible or necessary in the first place.
That's the idea. Heidegger stresses that this metaphysics of Dasein has its own kind of truth, separate from specific worldviews or theology. He argues that our understanding of being has to be projected onto time based on the finitude of Dasein in us. This explains why time has such a central metaphysical role in Kant's critique, and why it's so essentially linked to the transcendental power of imagination. Ultimately, Heidegger presents his fundamental ontological reading of Kant not as trying to just beat earlier interpretations, but as trying to bring to light things that might have been missed or overlooked.
This has certainly been a very deep dive into Heidegger's incredibly dense engagement with Kant's project, really focusing on human finitude and that complex dance between intuition, understanding, and the sometimes slippery power of imagination. It definitely makes you think about the very foundations of knowledge and being.
It does. Heidegger's work really pushes us, It challenges us to ask if our current ways of thinking about knowledge and reality truly grapple with these fundamental questions about our finite existence, the questions that Kant and Heidegger wrestled with so intensely. We'd certainly encourage you, if this has sparked your interest, to explore Heidegger's Kant and the problem of metaphysics, and of course Kant's critique of pure reason itself, to continue this thinking.
And maybe leave you with this thought. Does our modern understanding of knowledge, of reality, really measure up? Does it adequately address these deep questions about our finite existence that Kant and Heidegger put on the table?